Greetings. Welcome to another pre-concert video for the Victoria Symphony. I'm your host, Bob Fraser. We are about to launch into a very ambitious undertaking. On the weekend of the 22nd and 23rd of January at the Royal Theatre, and the weekend of the 29th to the 30th of January at the Farquhar Auditorium at UVic, we will be performing the first 8 of Beethoven's 9 symphonies in 4 concerts, 2 in each concert. Now the plan is to finish the season with a performance of the 9th symphony, thus completing the cycle. I know I've been hinting for a while that I might be coming back to doing live pre-concert lectures in the theaters an hour prior to the performance, like I always have in the past. But given where we are with you-know-what right now, we've decided in the interests of safety, it's still best to keep everyone from gathering in a tight spot. So the crews at both theaters are working like mad to keep everyone safe. So for now, I'm going to continue doing these videos. The camera and recording teams are coming to the performance of Beethoven's 2nd and 5th symphonies on January 23rd. And we'll be releasing those performances separately on our virtual season later on. In fact, the dates are February 17th for the 2nd Symphony and April 14th for the 5th. Now you can find all of those details on the Symphony's website. So what I've decided to do, when those virtual performances come out, I'll do a good analysis of the music of those 2 symphonies for you in 2 separate videos. And those will come out about a week before the performances are posted on the internet. So that leaves the other 6 symphonies, and they asked me to do just one big general introduction to the series. So, big question, what to talk about? It's not a good idea to try and analyze 8 different Beethoven symphonies in one video. So I'm titling this short video, Some Thoughts About Beethoven. Okay, first off, the reason for this Beethoven mini festival, it's actually not so mini, it's more like a mega festival for the musicians. As you almost certainly know, 2020 was the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth, and we planned on performing all 9 symphonies in March of that year. Well, we managed to get numbers 3 and 5 performed, but then you all know what happened next. Every orchestra in the world shut down all at once. We had actually made it to the dress rehearsal of the 2nd concert in that series, and the concert was canceled right after that dress rehearsal finished. Musicians had even left large instruments in the hall, had to go pick them up. So almost as an act of defiance against COVID, we decided that as soon as our music director could get back here for a decent stretch, and as soon as we have at least some assurance of being able to put on concerts, we're going to try this again, fingers crossed, even though 2 years have now passed since those initial cancellations. It's almost fitting to have a performance of Beethoven as an act of triumph over adversity when you consider how much of Beethoven's output was done through a veil of very serious hearing loss. Now, it's a pretty obvious statement that Beethoven looms very large in our world as performers. He is definitely the most performed composer in our repertoire history. There have been at least 15 complete cycles of his symphonies performed in our 80-year history. If you miss all of these upcoming performances, stick with us for a few more years and you will likely hear them all again. Just to give you some idea of how large Beethoven looms, here is a few things you might not know. If you take music history in university to be part of a music degree, your first year course is often, it used to be at any rate, divided into 2 parts. Everything up to Beethoven, everything after Beethoven. The War of the Romantics started with Beethoven, and I've talked about this a lot in my live pre-concert talks. There were 2 camps of composers, the progressives and the classicists. They both claimed to be the heirs of Beethoven. I've talked a lot in my pre-concert lectures about the influence of Beethoven on other composers. even the ones that ended up dismantling our system of tonality altogether. They all claimed influences from Beethoven, especially in his late works, like his late quartets. Our orchestra itself, the Victoria Symphony, and other similar-sized orchestras are calibrated, in a way, calibrated to be a vehicle for performances from Beethoven and his predecessors, Mozart and Haydn. Our full-time complement of musicians is just 34 players. That's just enough to perform almost all of Beethoven's symphonies and his concerti and those of his predecessors. Now, I think there are two very vocal groups of writers and thinkers about music. One of these groups is saying, enough with the Beethoven already, please leave some more space for neglected composers and emerging composers. And an equally vocal group is at the complete opposite position to this, saying, we can't get enough Beethoven. And you can't deny that 250 years later, he still sells lots of tickets. Thankfully, I think both of these groups are really, really small. I'd say less than 1% of the audience, but they're loud. And thankfully, I think 99% of you are happily in the middle part of that spectrum. So, why so much fuss about Beethoven? Is it a modern phenomenon because of recording and broadcasting and the internet? Well, let's look at that. We can't deny his popularity online. If you look at Spotify, and it's really interesting looking at classical music from the lens of Spotify. Spotify reports that Beethoven has on average just over 6 million listeners per month. And that's of December 2020. His birthday was in December, by the way. The only composer with more listeners, and this kind of surprised me a little, was Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, at 7.1 million listeners. By the way, Drake, this guy, he has 50 million listeners per month. So that kind of puts it in perspective. Still, Beethoven isn't doing too shabby for a guy who has been dead for close to 200 years. Some nerds worked out that Beethoven would be earning over $300,000 per year in Spotify royalties if he were alive today. Again, not too shabby. But this isn't really a modern phenomenon, this cult of Beethoven. Alex Ross, who is the music critic for The New Yorker, he wrote a really excellent piece on Beethoven where he outlined some scholarship by a fellow named William Weber. Now, Weber examined as many concert programs as he could in the city of Leipzig. It was a bit like looking at Spotify statistics, but in the 19th century. He determined that in 1782, which was Beethoven was 12 years old then, dead composers made up only 11% of the programs of music that was happening in Leipzig that year. Now, a century later, by 1870, not even 50 years after Beethoven's death, that percentage rose to 76% of the music. So 76% is now by dead composers. Now, that's a really significant statistic. It's almost as if after Beethoven, people were saying, we want to hear this again and again and again. It could also be that as music became more and more daring and progressive and out there, the faction that wanted to preserve the past grew stronger and stronger. Well, that's just human nature, isn't it? So I guess the underlying question in all of this is, what makes Beethoven so great that he would cause this kind of influence? What factors contribute to the fact that we're not only playing him this month, but we'll be performing him for many years to come? Why is an orchestra in this far-flung region of the world devoted so much to the performance of Beethoven? Now, even though there's a great craftsman at work behind these symphonies, and I'll demonstrate that in my videos about the second and the fifth symphonies, I think the real reason is more complex. Mostly I like to examine what happens in history around people. We sometimes make the mistake of assuming that a genius forms in a vacuum and somehow these people are just touched by the divine. I don't think that's very simple. I don't think it's that simple at all, actually. First of all, look at Beethoven's life. He lived from 1770 to 1827. This is a very interesting period in history, of course. French Revolution, American independence, huge spike in economic growth, the Enlightenment, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the end of the monarchy and the nobility, the rise of the capital, the rise of working class and middle class. So you have to look at those things. So history was ripe for somebody like Beethoven. His own teacher, Joseph Haydn, which I've talked about, he had the best orchestra in Europe at his disposal, and he was basically a laboratory for the development of the two forms for which Beethoven was remembered the most. One was the symphony, one was the string quartet. So you can't deny that studying with Haydn was a stroke in Beethoven's favor. The other thing, technological improvements to the piano. In 1783, a Scottish piano builder named John Broadwood, he got a patent for piano pedals. He also developed a really strong frame that allowed for a greater dynamic range than the pianos heretofore invented. They could play a lot louder. Why was this so significant? Because he sent one to Beethoven. These technological changes in the piano helped prolong Beethoven's career. Because of his deafness, he needed this loud instruments. By the way, for all you house fans, deafness could have been caused by lupus, by the way. Now, we can't underestimate the role of the piano in Beethoven's life because not only of his deafness, but remember, a lot of his superstar reputation during his life came from his keyboard abilities and his skills as an improviser. And of course, that's a skill that's very useful to a composer. The other thing to take note of in Beethoven's life, and probably what contributed to his stardom, the rise of the publishing industry. So 1750, 20 years before he was born, a man named Breitkopf opened up a publishing house in Leipzig, which was the town where Bach worked. Same as Schott in Mainz, Germany in 1770, the year Beethoven was born. Simrock in 1790. All of these publishers had one thing in common. They all published Beethoven. He was recognized very much in this emerging field as somebody who sells music. And Breitkopf and his partner Hertel are noteworthy because they were among the first publishers to produce scholarly editions of complete works of composers. So this is very much a 19th century thing, is to catalog everything that a composer wrote and put it out there in one big mass. So that had a lot to do with elevating composers to what we call canonical or cult status. Also can't ignore the rise of public concerts and operas. So people are starting to spend their spare time going to concerts. That means there's money to be made, and it's very easy to fall on the practice of marketing sure things. So these are just some of the random things to think about when you consider Beethoven and why he is still so popular today. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I'm working on developing a course about the history of the symphony orchestra as an institution. So rather than focusing on composers and their music like I do on these talks, I'm going to talk about how we got to having professional orchestras like the Victoria Symphony in most medium-sized cities and large cities in the world, and why orchestras look and sound and operate in the way they do. So this talk about Beethoven is a little bit of a good introduction to that. So I'll finish by saying, as I sometimes do, keep watching this space, and I'll see you next time.